usually they'll tell you no within a week or two. So sometimes it's worth a try.
Yeah, the editor decides. Yeah.
And does every do the different countries or like continents have different impact factors? For example, are the impact factors in the U.S. different from Europe? And
No.
so they're it's all the same.
Generally, science is international. All these journals publish articles from anywhere in the world.
Now, there might be Chinese journals or Russian journals I don't know about. If they're not English language journals, but most English language journals are international, and they're all it's a global market, so to speak. And the other thing besides impact factor is you can judge individual papers and to some extent individual researchers by looking at their citation rates, and all that information is in a database called the Web of Science, which OU has a subscription to, and you can get through the OU library. So it's a great way, first of all, to find out where the high impact papers are, and it's also a great way to search for papers on a topic you're working on. You want to find out not just some papers, but the big impact papers in your topic. You can do keyword searches and sort by number of citations. So I spend more time sort of when I'm thinking about citation rates of papers and people than I usually do about impact factors in journals.
What if you cite your own paper?
You know, people do all the time, and sometimes in the Web of Science you can actually click a button that will remove self-citations.
Yeah.
It's a little bit bad form to cite yourself excessively, but usually in a journal that blocks out the name of the author, you can usually figure out the author by looking at the references, and whoever's cited the most is typically the author.
Right, and that isn't as negative as it sounds, because people who are publishing in an area are usually creating part of that area, and their back work really has to be cited. So I'm a guilty of citing myself.
I'm guilty too. I think we virtually all are.
And I agree with going to the Web of Science. If you want to know what some person is doing in the field, just put their name and the author link, and if it's Smith, of course you're going to get thousands of people. So if you know what university there's a way of just looking at Smith at the university, and you could then find out what they've done for the last 30 years, essentially. It goes way back.
Like it or not, your potential employers, your potential tenure committee reviews, they're all going to be looking at citation rates. And you know, they're not the perfect metric, but they're one that's widely used, and at least it's quantitative. So you kind of best expect it.
My advisor told me 10 citations is the same as writing one paper. For her opinion, that's something. We'll move right along.
I once had a friend who told me in the long run over your whole career, each citation was worth $1,000.
Oh, really? Wow.
In that case, I'm going to self-cite. Origin of feces. How do you write an academic paper? Where do you start? How do you get an idea? When you're just thinking about, well, I need to write a paper, publish or perish, right? How do you write a paper?
It's too late if you've read that stuff. This papers don't come out of, usually, Einstein actually sat there at a patent office and did exactly that. Maybe I'll just do this. But usually it comes out of something you're doing actively in a laboratory or in some sort of environment which is generating your interest and so on. And from that you gain ideas. So there has to be something you're actively pursuing. And once you question that and get results, and if you see something new that is, one of the criteria of doing this, if you're working in an area, is to know the literature in that area. Because I found myself doing this too often. I go in the lab and I do something I think is, this is a breakthrough. I'm going to be famous. And then I do the literature search and find out it was done 20 years ago, right? So in a way, it's fulfilling to know that you're as smart as those people were back then, but it doesn't do you a bit of good to repeat in the laboratory what's been done 20 years ago. As a matter of fact, you try to publish that, your name is mud, right? As a matter of fact, there are people who do that, make that mistake, and the first thing that a reviewer does, if they're familiar with the field, is to say, this was published, long ago. This person has not even read the literature in the area. That's a good way to get yourself rejected. So the first thing you've got to do before you write the paper is do the literature search and get the idea.
When I was a new graduate student, I was a little bit confident. I told my thesis advisor, I says, I want to do my dissertation on something that's my own idea. Don't give me a project. I want to do my own idea. Well, that didn't happen. And it almost never happens. So usually, as far from the point of view of a student, you're usually working with a mentor who has a track record and has an ongoing research project. If you could go in and just out of the blue as a student come up with publishable dissertation ideas, you're really ahead of the game. So don't feel too bad. You want to eventually develop that skill. You have to if you're going to make it in academia. But if you don't have it as a new graduate student, don't get worried too much.
Yeah, nobody does.
Nobody does.
All right, now this is where the rubber meets the road here. These are the pieces of a research paper, and this is the one that was.
Those are the details, but we can go back to yours.
well, I'm just. I mean, we can either say that I'm going to go to the next question, and then we'll go back. This isn't going to be funny or anything, but what's included in an academic paper? So let's go through these. Do you want one of these like laser things?
Well, no, we can just point. We're close. Now everybody's probably seen an academic paper of sorts of any journal pretty much follows this script. You have the title and the authors and their affiliations, but each of these have their own little rules and regulations about, for example, the authors. Who's first is usually the person who gets the most credit for it. And the research advisor, if you're in a group where you're the student and the research advisor is the person who is directing the research, that person usually is the last author in the field I'm in. But that's not always true.
Yeah, it's the way it is in physics, but for instance in math, they usually publish in alphabetical order. And I don't know about other fields I'm really not that familiar with, but in the sciences, it's usually just as you said. First author is usually, oftentimes the paper is cited as Sevilla et al. And so you really want to be Sevilla and not be one of the et al.
But if you're the research advisor, as I am, there are no Sevilla et al.
That's what it used to be, I'm sure.
So it's the student who does the research work who gets the person who does the actual work, who wrote the thesis, if it's a thesis project, that's the first author, and that's usually the case anyway. Then the affiliation, say that you wrote your thesis, the paper's published, but you're no longer at Oakland University, you're over in U of M, say, or something. The paper that comes out of Oakland University has Oakland University as the affiliation, and your new address is put as a subscript. So the affiliation is where you did the work, not where you are. Okay. And then the abstracts, it depends on the length, depends on the journal rules, but it's 200 to 300 words usually. And it's a summary of the purpose, the major findings, and its significance, in very short.
Yeah. It's not an introduction. It is a summary.
Right. And then the introduction has to present that background to what you are about. what in the literature gave you the basis for doing the project? And what's the problem with the literature you are trying to solve? Because the literature sets the base for what is known, and you're trying to now change that. And what are you changing? That the literature, is the literature wrong? Is there a conundrum in the literature that you're trying to solve? That's where you set, that's where you can lose the interest of your readers if you don't set out a problem that is of any interest to them. As a matter of fact, you will lose the interest in the title because it may be a topic that the reader's not interested in. That's the purpose of the title, is to set the topic for those who are interested in that area. So you want in the title enough to get the basic concept of what you're dealing with. And then in the introduction, we've just talked about methods and material.
Let me just mention a couple things about the introduction. First of all, there's usually a lot of citations to the literature in introduction, more than almost any other place in the paper. And you'll often have an introduction that might be 3 or 4 paragraphs, and it'll be like this. It'll be paragraph 1, 2, 3, will be a whole lot of discussion about the background, a lot of citations. And then the last paragraph of the introduction will often begin, so our goal is, and then you'll state your hypothesis and what your overall goal is, and then you go to the methods. That's a very typical structure.
Yes, I have a question about what you just said about the introduction. You say that in the introduction you could put some citations that are relevant to the concept you're introducing, correct? But one of the papers that I wrote, one of their comments was that they didn't like the way I put some of the references. Actually, they didn't like me putting the references in the introduction section. They just said all the references should be in the related work. So I was kind of struck because some of the things that I was introducing, I was trying to reference some previous work that had been done. And so therefore I had to give Caesar what belongs to Caesar in the intersection. But here now they come and say that, you know, you can't put citations in the intersection. So
if I can, in computer science they usually will have a separate section for background and related work. It's a big issue whether you put it at the beginning of the paper or the end of the paper, but it's really, that's a computer science,
Okay.
so it's not really, you know, the same principle applies. In that section, we have all of our citations, practically the whole paper.
So
We would break it up into 2 pieces. Cause,
the
you know,
introduction is broken into.
you can't explain all the details. Sometimes you put it at the end because,
Really?
well, you don't know if the reader knows what the field that well. You know, the reviewer could be wireless communications, but there's a lot of stuff, you know, to know.
Oh, yes.
So I read that review and they didn't like it. No, somebody's not going to like everything, but the principle is the same. You said that if we include introduction and related work and background in the same piece, then you want to make it short enough that you don't lose the reader.
Correct.
Right, which was the guy's point in your review. And but it's got to make sure that you're building on somebody else's work. You can't just be making up your own idea and say, I think this is balancing.
Right.
It's balancing.
Right, it is. Yeah, you can't cite everything in your introduction. The introductions are often a couple of pages at the most.
Yeah.
Sometimes really good papers can have introductions of only a couple of paragraphs because the problem is set out very clearly and the literature is only a few papers that are relevant. If that's the case, there's no reason to extend it. That would be fine.
One more thing is that most journals will have instructions for authors that will lay all this out in detail,
Correct.
so that you don't have to kind of guess. You know,
Absolutely.
so the first thing, if you decide on a journal, the first thing to do is read their instructions for
Right.
authors.
Because journals don't always have these in exactly this order. Some will put materials and methods at the end.
Yeah, I hate that.
Yeah, okay. And
So, just to follow up on that question, so in the intersection, also there's, I mean, people are not agree on what to put there. For example, in the intersection, some advisors say, put almost summarize almost everything in the intersection, including probably part of the results, so that when the reviewer reviews the paper, from the intersection, he has a clear idea of what he's going to be doing. But other scholars say that, there's no need for you to put, at least to summarize the results in the intro. Because in the intro, you said, this is what I'm doing, this is what has been done, and I'm going to show that my research or my experiment has produced certain results. So you want to summarize those results in the intro. But some scholars say it's not appropriate. So there's a great area there that I'd like you to elaborate on.
My preference is to not put any results in the introduction, but the abstract should have had a brief statement of your main results. So they already should have seen it if they read the abstract, but I never put results in my introduction.
I sometimes do what you do. So here are two people who are publishing. I will set the problem out and I'll say we've solved it in this way in I will say a single sentence or so that just that lets them know where you're going.
Maybe a single sentence, yeah.
You prefer to have the abstract do that, and that's fine. That's fine.
All right, let's go on to that.
Yeah, go ahead. You know about this.
I have a question about that. Like, going to the point of how much background you want to put in. Sometimes you find the reviewers, and I know you have to please the reviewers to get your stuff published. They will ask you questions like, you need to refer stuff that's like, if you're sending it to a journal that's already very close to what you do, and everybody knows, whoever's reading the paper already knows what is the basics behind it. Like, how much background do you need to put in? Like, I mean, if I'm doing MRI and cartilage, like, when you're explaining magic angle, everybody knows what magic angle is, but the reviewer is asking, explain this, but it's like an addition paragraph explaining this stuff.
Sometimes you have to add stuff to please reviewers, but we'll come back to that. I usually would not put in too much details. I would say the main things, I would cite references where they can go to get the details, unless it's something that's absolutely crucial to my whole point. And if they don't get that piece of background, then I might give it a few sentences. But I don't go off on a several paragraph digression.
You just can't do that. And there are review articles and something like magic angle that's in the literature. It's in textbooks.
Yeah.
You would never have to really describe that in detail unless it's an educational.
So I submit the paper and then got a review, and then the one reviewer has a really good point and a really short paragraph, so I don't need too much revise. But the other reviewer give a list of questions, and then he asked almost every single thing, even I cited. He or she, I don't know exactly. The reviewer want me to explain things, even I cite the paper. In that case, should I put the short paragraph for please the reviewer?
And some reviewers can cause your paper to look like it's been just cut up to pieces, and you want to avoid that. You can't let the reviewer take your paper over and make it disjointed and so on. So what you would do is answer their questions and take what you can from the reviewer, as long as the paper maintains its integrity in terms of improving your work. But don't let reviewers make your paper into something you had no plans to have it, unless it's an improvement, okay? So you can fight back against reviewers without being combative. You can say, yes, you can answer their question, but not in your paper, okay? That's one way to treat it. You answer their question fully. If they are making a point that you could answer, you can just say, yes, that's true. And it's covered in reference 22, so we didn't see why we should put it in our paper.
Yeah, I tend to be a little bit more towards just trying to do what the reviewer wants, to satisfy the guy or woman, whoever. But it's a balancing act, and oftentimes you want to try to address their point in your paper, but do it as briefly as possible. And don't go off on some big digression. If they want you to cite a couple papers, we'll cite the papers and move on. Or if they want you to describe something, add a sentence and describe it. But don't let them take it over.
Right.
And don't let them ever put mistakes into your paper.
Absolutely. I agree with this, but I think she was describing a certain, that's exactly what I do. I mean, if they're asking you to make minor changes and they're reasonable and it makes the paper look better, there's nothing wrong with that. But if they're going through every sentence of your paper and they're causing you to change wording or meanings and so on, there comes to be a point where you can't. But I advise exactly what Dr. Roth said, be tolerant to your reviewer because they hold your paper in their hands. But don't let them ruin your paper, right? Okay.
Let's move on to the next topic, just so that there's time, I think.
Can I
Yeah.
ask, sorry, one
Sure,
last
go ahead.
question? Sometimes I see when you're submitting, so you're just submitting into the website to a specific journal, and it asks you there for the summary also. So it asks you to add a little summary for a few lines. I don't exactly, I didn't exactly, I don't know what exactly they mean by that. You have sort of a summary in the abstract because you're explaining.
I usually cut and paste the abstract and stick it there.
So that's okay to do that?
Well, it depends a little bit. I'll read the instructions of the journal. If they specifically say the summary is different and that the summary has a different purpose, then I guess you got to write something up. But if they just want a summary, to me, that's the abstract.
The only thing that the summary would not have is the purpose out of the abstract. Usually you give some purpose or something in the abstract of why you did the work. Summary is the major features of your findings. So it would be a little, that's the way I would view it. And so conclusions are a little bit different than a summary. Sometimes people write summary and conclusions. They summarize what they're doing and then but that's can all be part of the discussion. So there are a lot of papers that have no conclusion, no summary section. They just have the discussion and it ends, but the last couple of paragraphs are the purpose of summary and conclusions.
Yeah, I've had reviewers tell me to cut the conclusion section right out. The paper's too long, and in some ways that's not a problem. It sometimes reads just fine without the conclusion section. As long as you said the conclusions, read your discussion and the results. Is there anything else you want to say? Let me just note that when I'm writing a paper, I usually, when I sit down in front of the blank screen, the first thing I write is the methods. Because that's something you know what you did. I mean, just describing what you did, you know that. It's real easy to write. Then you usually write the results, which consists of mainly figures and citations to figures. And then, once I've gotten those down, I'll go back and I'll work on the introduction and discussion. That's how I do it.
Yeah. And everybody does it differently. I create the figures and tables, and then, because I find that's what the paper's about, and then I sort of, everything else comes out from that. Yeah. And so the methods would be the next thing that I would do. But you don't start with the introduction, because actually, if you haven't really written the results section yet, you don't know, you haven't really thought it all through. And you'd be surprised when you're writing your paper how much insight you get into the results you should have been thinking about in this way. I often end up going back in the lab and saying, why didn't I do this before? It's obvious I should have, but you didn't think about it until you started writing it up. So I'm in a feedback loop with the results section for a while. So the introduction comes later, and that's pretty much the
pretty much what I do too.
one says, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. And in the chalkboard it says, then a miracle occurs. What makes one paper better than another?
Well, first of all, it's importance. If you have a really important research finding, it's generally going to be a better paper. And the other thing is that is your writing. I can't stress enough how I think it's important for scientists to be able to write, because I've reviewed a lot of papers, and I hate to say it, but a lot of papers coming from non-native English speakers who really don't have the English quality, and you can take a great science idea and you can ruin it by writing it very poorly.
Right.
So I think those are the two things. The quality of the research idea still has to be absolutely #1 priority, but then write it well, clear English is really important too.
May I address that real quickly? I work in the Writing Center.
Okay.
Anyone at OU, there is no excuse for having an ESL problem with your paper.
Okay.
Because every person here has the opportunity to get that fixed. You just have to come take the opportunity.
And we're very lucky in the United States because the language of science is our native language. And I feel bad for people who have to write their science in a non-native language, but it's just the way it is. So you just got to learn to deal with it. Sorry.
Yeah, the clarity of your exposition will make or break your paper. You can take a great finding and hide it with unclear, ambiguous language. And so I second that strongly.
Some students want to go into science because they don't like to write, and that's a big mistake.
You bet.
If you don't mind my making a comment, my wife is from South Korea, and she's always trying to improve her writing and her job. And I find that even in the department here too, if you do subject, verb, object, it becomes remarkably clear. My advisor's Chinese, and her papers are great. Dr. Shu's outstanding because he thinks clearly and he writes clearly. But the writing can't be, you can't avoid it. It has to be there.
Yes.
I don't mind if somebody forgets to put the right article in there, but I do mind if I don't know what the object of the sentence is. Right?
Or it's confused and repeated, and the paragraph doesn't hold together logically. It's got to be a clear presentation. And science is not literature, and you actually have to force yourself to write in short declarative sentences, so you don't make sentences that have ands and lots of wherebys and so on. It's not legal language that you're trying to hide something. Some scientists write that way because they're trying to hide something. So if you see a scientific paper that says, well, what did that mean? It probably means that they didn't know what they were talking about. Right? So you could assume that. If it's clearly stated, unambiguously, then it's a good science statement. Okay. If it's unclear, it means the author's unclear about it, or they don't have the proper English.
My motto is it has to be, first of all, correct, then it has to be clear, and in third place is concise, because you've got to write, you can't expect people to be reading long tomes. You got to write briefly and in a short way, but still clear.
Okay. So the importance and clarity. All right, the next one is, we love all the words in your manuscript, but we were wondering if you could maybe put them in a completely different order. That's a review process, right? What happens in the revision process when you revise your paper?
Well, I find...
We've talked about it a little bit.
Yeah, we've talked about this, but I think what I have found over the years is that the reviewers who give you the negative reviews, when they find a flaw, often are your best friends, they're giving you a real boost because they're not allowing you to publish something that could be wrong, or it's a little mistaken, or whatever. However your feelings are hurt, you can call it whatever you like, but But they are directing you to go somewhere else with that paper outside, so it is truer than where it was. And if you see that that's really true, that you've made some sort of logical error, or you didn't do the critical control experiment, or whatever, you don't get angry at the reviewer, you thank them, because they have saved you from poor work, and now your work, when completed, is going, maybe it's going to take you that extra 6 months to do the work or whatever. Yes, and we're all human. We know that 6 months requires, maybe you don't take that vacation or whatever it is, but the work that comes out is scientifically better, and for your career, that's an improvement. So, what happens in the revision process? Improved papers, if you're lucky, right?
And the review process, reviewers can take various lengths of time, but I think like 2 months is kind of typical. And usually you have to revise it once, but it's not too uncommon to have to revise it a couple times, or even a third time. If you start getting more than that, usually the editor is just going to give up and reject it. But it is. I agree with you. You have to have a thick skin about it. You have to, you get the review and you read it, then go home and kind of do whatever you do to relieve stress, play racquetball or something, and then go back the next day and start making the changes.
A glass of wine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
This one is scientists.
We got a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry. Isn't it a good idea that if you do send the paper in and you're rejected, but of course you get comments of the reviewers, is it a good idea to submit it again to the same journal or not?
Actually, I've been through a process like that, and my paper was rejected for a incorrect reason. Now, the journal that I sent it to, I explained it to the editor, and he said, well, both reviewers rejected your paper. Our journal policy is that you cannot resubmit that paper. So I said, well, they're both wrong, and I am going to change the title, and I'm going to do this work to show they're wrong, and I'm going to resubmit it under a new title. Would you accept it? And he said, yes, I would.
What do you mean, would you review it again?
Would they accept it as a paper for review?
Yeah, not accepted.
And I said, please send it to the same reviewers.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
Because I wanted to show that how wrong they were. So, it got accepted.
All right. There you go.
So
But,
reviewers can be wrong as well as right. Yeah.
But it's you better be right when you do it. I mean, if you're not sure and you just kind of want to be stubborn, maybe it isn't a good idea. But if you really know that there was a mistake and you can show it,
Right.
then you could give it a try.
Yeah, for the most cases, the best thing to do is just take the paper, correct what you can, and send it to another journal. Okay, and you have to realize that other journal may send it to the same reviewers, so you do really need to pay attention to what they say.
I've had papers sent to me to review from different journals, the same paper, and
Right.
you keep sending it to me. They think I'm appropriate, and so I know that's got to be happening to my own papers too.
Right. And if you've already rejected it,
Yeah.
you can't change your mind.
Right.
Right. If nothing has changed. Generally, authors make a serious attempt to correct. Although you find some that are hard-headed and don't.
How do you know, like, if the reviewer, like, if it's a second time reviewer and you're like, okay, I'm trying to make my point and you've done the best you can. Like, what's the point where you know, like, okay, I'm gonna send it somewhere else? Like, there's no point arguing with these reviewers, or you're not gonna get the paper published.
You start arguing the same things over and over with the reviewer. That's really a bad sign.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
where you call the editor
Yeah.
and you say, we are at an impasse. I'm pretty sure I'm right here. They sometimes send it to a third reviewer to make a judgment call between the two, and that's one way they can do it. And sometimes the editor will read it themselves and say, no, I believe you're correct, and actually actually publish your paper without going further. So the most often would be a third reviewer.
Can you send the same paper to different journals at the same time to increase your chance?
That's
of
considered
getting it
unethical.
published?
That's really considered bad form. I don't know what punishment there would be if you were caught, but it's usually considered wrong to be, because they're going to send it out to reviewers, and that means you're going to be, instead of having 2 people have to review paper, you're going to have 2 people reviewing it and 2 people wasting their time. So that really wouldn't be good form. I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah, every journal I know about makes you sign a statement it hasn't been sent anywhere else. This is the only place, because they have a copyright form that you have to sign. So they get the copyright as soon as you submit it, essentially. So it would be, you would be violating that. You could be sued, actually. So
If you translate it from English to Chinese,
to what?
what if you translate it, one in English here and one in Chinese? Send this there, this here.
Are you saying would you be caught or would it be ethical? There might be different answers.
I don't think it'd be ethical.
Right,
if
it
you
wouldn't
were-
be ethical,
yeah.
but you might not be caught.
Yeah.
Okay.
So make sure I understand this. So if you write a paper and you submit it and it gets rejected with revisions, you correct you can't submit it back to the same journal, or
If
you
it's
can.
rejected, fine, and you get a letter from the editor of the journal that your paper is rejected by that journal, they will not accept it back. Okay, that is the usual policy. That now, if you can discuss that with the editor and say, well, I'm going to make these revisions and resubmit it. Can I do that? You can discuss that with them, and they will say yes often. However, the most common thing is that you take that paper, revise it, and send it to another journal. That's the usual practice.
And the usual response from a journal, in my experience, is maybe 5% of them will just accept my paper off the bat, 5 will totally reject it, and 90% will say revise and resubmit. And that, of course, you then revise and resubmit almost in every case. So it's kind of rare that you're being rejected outright without a chance to revise. But if they do say rejected outright, my general inclination would be go find someplace greener pastures.
But there's some journals that you mentioned, Nature and so on, that actually do an editorial cull.
Yeah.
And what that means is they select papers only that they think will be high-impact papers, and they don't really send it out for review. The editor just sends your paper is not really suitable for our magazine, essentially, because they're looking for something that is flashy and people will get. And Nature and Science have both made tremendous mistakes because they're looking for that flashy, big story, and they publish things like polywater or they had a cold fusion one. Yeah, well, they didn't publish the cold fusion, but they did. There's this fellow called Terry Ogden who did bubble fusion, and that was on the Science magazine's cover. Right, and it was not fusion, and it was just a little bubble with a little light coming out of it. But it was sexy, flashy, and so people, it's fusion in a little bit of water. So I really don't think that scientifically it is such a big advantage